Hello, and welcome to Lesson 5. With this lesson, we begin the second unit of the course. Keep in mind that the course is divided into 3 units. First, we looked at antiquity with the ancient Greeks and Romans, and now we're looking at medieval literature. In the medieval portion of the class will be divided into 3 sections, where first we look at medieval Islamic literature in this lesson, medieval French literature in the next lesson, and medieval Italian literature in the final lesson for this unit. And then the final unit of the course will be the Renaissance. So going from antiquity to the Middle Ages or medieval period to the Renaissance. In our first author we're going to look at when we look at medieval Islamic literature here is Rumi. It would probably be good right now to review a little bit of the beliefs and values of the ancient cultures we looked at, Greek and Roman. Belief, they were polytheistic cultures. They believed in multiple gods. Pride was very important. They were also very fatalistic cultures in terms of believing that fate was preordained. And then we looked at epic poems and tragic plays, some of the genres we've looked at so far. Here we're going to look at lyric poetry with Rumi, and then a frame narrative with 1001 Nights. And those are both very different from the genres we've looked at so far. Each section of the textbook is divided up. Well, the textbook is divided into 3 units, and each of those units begins with a little introductory section. The introductory section for the medieval period is called Circling the Mediterranean, Europe, and the Islamic World. So I'm going to take just a few minutes and hit the highlights of that section for you. This is a really appropriate title. The Mediterranean is central to our entire course, central to the emergence of Western civilization. The name Mediterranean very appropriately means in the middle of lands. As we talked about with the ancient Greeks and Romans, the Mediterranean facilitated trade and exchange, especially of songs and stories. It was a single complex web that knit together distant lands. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, other ancient cultures from antiquity would share their oral tales when they traded goods and other things. In the Middle Ages, with the Middle Ages here, we're jumping much further ahead in time, over 1,000 years roughly. But even that much later, the Mediterranean still remains very important because the Mediterranean knit together the East and the West. As you know, this class surveys Western literature so that through taking the class we can begin to understand the role Western literature played in the emergence of Western civilization. But this unit on the medieval period begs the question, what is Western civilization? How do we find that? The title, the West or Western civilization, Western literature, those terms make us think of a geographical place. And the term the West or Western civilization does come from a geographical place, but it's come to mean much more in the millennia since literature started to appear in those areas. The term Western civilization, or more succinctly, the West, refers to a series of ideas, beliefs, and values, more so than a geographical place. Those specific beliefs and values arose in Western Europe, which is why we have the title the West, but certainly went out into other parts of the world through trade, expansion, imperialism, etc. And so the West has come to mean much more than a geographical place, but really any place that fits the mold of Western civilization. And geography becomes less and less a part of it. A great example is our Native American tribes, who are more typically associated with Eastern beliefs and values and Eastern cultures, even though they're geographically located in the United States, which is the United States in general is more of kind of a Western type of society. And so what that example I just gave illustrates is that the West is much more of an idea, a mythological construct, if you will, than a geographical place. Which is why this last point here refers to the invention of the West. And so, similarly, the East is also kind of a mythological construct. Once again, initially based on geography, but no longer completely bound by geography. And so, with the invention of the West and the invention of the East, you could say, scholars who have looked back and studied the Middle Ages and other earlier time periods have invented these categories of East and West that have for a long time really helped define, Western civilization and thought. But these categories are not stable at all. They're very fluid. East and West are both, highly diverse entities with changing values and varied cultures. And this is important to recognize. For a long time, scholars have not recognized neither the East nor the West as fluid entities and tried to treat them as more stable entities and also projected them as opposites. So because many scholars for a long time have described these entities as opposites, we've come to culturally, on a kind of a widespread level, think of them that way. But if we look back and look more closely at the history, they're really not just opposites. They have much in common, the East and the West. What people most typically think of when they think of Western civilization is Christian Europe that emerged in the Middle Ages. And when people think of the West, that was the West. When people think of the East, they often think of Islam. And so that's in part because scholars position these things, these entities, these constructs as opposite. A big contributor to that were the Crusades that took place during the Middle Ages in the spread of Christianity and Islam. As we transition from the previous part of the course, you can think about how the ends of the Greek and Roman empires and those polytheistic cultures eventually gave way to the emergence of two monotheistic cultures, Christianity in the West and Islam in the East. And so the emergence after Christ's birth of those two religious cultures, one in the East, one in the West, and then as they both spread and the Middle Ages were in full swing, the Holy Wars, the Crusades that emerged as part of that, these couple of events led scholars to start to position these places as opposite. But in actuality, they interacted quite a bit in much more positive ways, trading, sharing stories, etc. And so we can't really study the emergence and development of Western civilization without also studying the East, which is why we're looking at Islamic literature in this first lesson on the medieval period. When scholars group these things, they'll tend to group them in certain ways. For instance, the language most commonly spoken in the West was Latin. The language most commonly spoken in the East was Arabic. Rome was the seat of imperial power in the West. Byzantium, which eventually became Constantinople and today is known as Istanbul, was the seat of power in the East. Christianity was associated with the West. Islam was associated with the Middle East. And so these things get, divided up and kind of separated and associated with one or the other, either east or west. But in actuality, they have much in common. Many of the stories in Christianity are similar to the stories in Islam, and many of the pieces of literature, such as 1001 Nights, that say emerged in the Middle East, drew on and simultaneously influenced stories and pieces of literature that emerged in the West, etc. So literature helps reveal that although this was a time of war and conflict between two different cultures/regions, at the same time, those cultures and regions had much more in common, and it doesn't serve us well to only look at it as a time of conflict. And so that's really the main point of this introductory section, is that the Mediterranean is representative of how it's symbolic. As an ocean, it's symbolic of how Europe and Islam, West and East, actually had much more in common, even though they were often at conflict during that time. And why in a class that's called Masterpieces of the Western World, we are studying some Eastern literature, because we wouldn't be able to fully understand the West without studying the East, essentially, which I think is a really important point that ties into the theme of the course regarding cosmopolitanism. So with that background, diving into this lesson, let's take a look at our specific author, who is Rumi. He was born in one of the easternmost regions of Persia, in the Persian Empire at the time, the 13th century CE. But the Persian Empire no longer exists. It eventually fell, as all empires do, and so that part of the Middle East would be modern-day Afghanistan, or it is modern-day Afghanistan. But he didn't spend most of his life there. He spent most of his life in a place called Konya, which is modern-day Turkey. His name, Rumi, means inhabitant of Rum, and that was a newly Islamic region that had formerly been held by Christian Byzantium, the eastern seat of the Roman Empire. So he is associated with the Islamic religion. But part of the reason why we're studying him first is he was well-read, he knew about all different kinds of religions, and as you'll see in the poetry, he didn't necessarily like to embrace the values of just one religion or be completely defined by one religion. He was a very cosmopolitan type of spiritual leader who gained a huge following during the time. And he's still popular today. He's the Middle Eastern poet who's most widely read in the Western world. So Rumi, with his cosmopolitan themes of his poetry and his popularity outside of the East, his popularity in the West, despite being an Eastern poet, for those two things, he really embodies what we just talked about on the previous slide about the overlap between the East and the West, especially during the Middle Ages when he lived. He was surrounded by conflict. He was surrounded by the violence of the Crusades, but still found it as his goal to write about peace and a more cosmopolitan view of spirituality in his poetry than was embraced by the majority of his contemporaries. And I think that message of peace is what makes his poetry so popular all around the world still to this day, as well as the complexity of it. And so he's also personally one of my favorite poets. The reading questions are a little bit different this time. As I mentioned on the recall slide, with Rumi, we're reading lyric poetry for the first time. So we've read, before this point, epic and tragic poetry. And epic poetry and tragic plays, tragic drama. So epic poetry, especially in translation, really reads more like a novel, because epic poems are long poems that tell narratives. Whereas lyric poetry is very short poetry that usually talks about a situation or idea or single event or person or something. Lyric poems are too short to really tell a story, and so they focus on subject matter that doesn't typically involve a narrative. And as I said before, as we study the emergence, growth, development of Western civilization, it's important to look at the different genres of literature and how they help define Western civilization. So with Rumi, we have an opportunity to look at a new genre. But reading lyric poetry is very different than what we've read so far. And because it's very short, a lot of content is packed in 10 lines or 30 lines, as opposed to, hundreds or thousands of lines, like with the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid. So, along those lines, I have some suggestions here to help you do the reading. If you haven't already done these things, reading the poems before listening to the lecture, I highly advise you kind of pause this and do this now with the poems. So with lyric poetry, you can read a poem, say like the first Rumi poem, Dissolver of Sugar, in a matter of seconds, probably less than a minute, because it's 10 lines long. And you could do all of the readings on Rumi in, probably 5 minutes total, if you just read them through a normal pace. But to really get the value out of them, to really see how they could be considered masterpieces, I highly recommend you take at least close to the same amount of time you normally would. Normally you take 2 to 3 hours to read the reading I've assigned you for half of a lesson. Here, I recommend you take maybe not quite that long, but much longer than just a few minutes, close to that amount of time, and follow these steps. And that way you'll get much more out of these poems. So here's my advice. Read the poem out loud slowly. Poetry uses all kinds of devices that make the way it sounds very important to interpreting its meaning. So rather than reading it in your head, especially since it's short, read it out loud. Furthermore, especially with short lyric poetry, the meaning's often more abstract than in a narrative poem, because you're not just following it for the events, you're trying to extrapolate an idea. And the poet will use language or sound or other poetic devices to convey the meaning, which makes the meaning somewhat more abstract, and you have to unpack it. So read the poem out loud slowly once. Then when you read it a second time, try to paraphrase it. In the margins of your book, next to each line, translate the line. I know it's already in translation in English, but it's lyric, poetic English. So try to say more plainly and commonly what the poet is saying. Your interpretation. What do you think the line means? Write that out. So go through it line by line and try to paraphrase it. Try to translate it, so to speak. Write out a paraphrase of it. Once you've done that and you feel pretty confident about your paraphrase, read through the paraphrase, and have that in your mind. And then finally, read the poem itself out loud again now that you've done the paraphrasing and read your paraphrase. And hopefully through that process, the meaning of the poem, what the speaker's trying to say, will be clear. Now, literature is always open to interpretation. That's part of the fun of it. That's why I ask you to post on the discussion board and engage in those discussions with you. I think we can have a lot of fun debating, what these literary texts mean, what they're trying to say. So there's certainly more than one way to interpret these Rumi poems or any short lyric poetry. And this is true with all forms of literature, but lyric poetry, even more so than other genres, really lends itself to multiple interpretations. Because it's short, abstract, complex, complicated, there's a lot to unpack in a very short space. With that said, though, that doesn't mean we can interpret it in any way we want. At the same time, it's very important to make sure our interpretation, no matter how much it differs from someone else's interpretation, follows the text closely. Look at the words. Is the evidence there to support the idea, or is the idea too much of a stretch? We call that close reading. The timing here is very fortuitous in that you have your first paper due right after this lesson, and so I ask you to do close reading in the paper to prove your argument. And poetry, short lyric poetry like this, kind of demands you do close reading. So as we go through these skills here of close reading the poetry, think about and try to apply those skills to whatever passages you choose to cite from the literary work you write about in your paper. The other reading question here has to do with the time in which Rumi lived. So as I said, it was a violent period with the Crusades in full swing. So how does his poetry respond to the religious violence around him with regards to his attitude towards spirituality? We talked about this a little bit already when I said he's a very cosmopolitan poet, but we'll continue to pursue it as we look at the actual poems. So the portion of the lecture where we look at the actual literary text is a little bit different this time. I have one question about each poem, but at the same time, I think it's better to just go through and do that close reading I just talked about. So these questions can be guiding, they can be helpful, especially if you do better with specific questions. But what I'm actually going to do for this portion of the lecture is go through the poems kind of line by line, doing a paraphrase type of thing, and give you my interpretation of the poems. What I'd recommend you do is do that yourself. Do the paraphrase, come up with the interpretation, your interpretation from your paraphrase, and I have some instructions on the next slide, kind of step by step how to do that. So hopefully you did that following my reading questions I sent out before coming to this lecture, but if you haven't, I would definitely pause it and do that now. So here are the steps I was talking about. Unfortunately, I have not updated this slide, and I apologize for that. Essentially, I updated the slide recently, but somehow it did not make it onto the recording. I don't know what happened there, and so I apologize for that. But the steps, not broken down as succinctly, but the steps were on that previous reading question slide. And so you could right now open Canvas to the reading questions announcement I sent out last week and look there. But essentially, what I'd be asking you to do here, if you haven't already done it, is pause the lecture, read the poem out loud, try to paraphrase it line by line, read your paraphrase, then reread the poem out loud, and then write in 2 or 3 sentences a summary of your interpretation of the poem. That this is what you think the poem is about. And so again, and I apologize for not having that on the slide. I thought it would be there. I must have opened the wrong file on accident. I apologize for that. But being as we're deep in the recording now, I'm going to go ahead and give you my interpretations of each poem. Remember that these are not the sole ways to interpret these poems. I'll also try to give you briefly some interpretations that I've heard over the years of teaching Rumi from students that differ a little bit from my own, but are still well supported by the text. With the first poem, Dissolver of Sugar, we have something really interesting, which is called a metaphor, which is where a poet compares 2 things that are not necessarily similar. So the metaphor here is obviously the sugar dissolving probably in a cup of tea or something like that. And the sugar dissolving could represent a number of things. Now, when I interpret this poem, when I read it through first out loud before I paraphrased it, the line, "You grieve and I begin to feel lighter," line 8, I believe, just stood out to me. I couldn't get that line out of my mind. I couldn't get away from that. And so when I was rereading the poem, paraphrasing it, the first time I did this years ago, that line, "You grieve and I begin to feel lighter," just, influenced my whole interpretation of it. And so I should add, you should have your book open now so you can be looking at the actual lines of the poem, so that since they're not on this screen. But if we do take, as I do in my reading, "You grieve and I begin to feel lighter," as kind of the central line of the poem, and there's not necessarily a reason why that should be the case, it was just the line that stood out to me personally the most, then I would see the sugar dissolving as a metaphor that represents a person who has died. And since it says dissolve me, the person who has died would be the speaker of the poem. Every short lyric poem has a speaker and a listener. And he's clearly talking to someone. He says, you breathe, you grieve, you keep me away. And so that you there, that second person pronoun you, would represent the listener. And so I see the speaker as someone who has passed away, and the listener being someone who is grieving over the person who has passed away. And by dissolving me in the sugar, or as the sugar dissolving into the tea, the speaker is saying, dissolve me, move on from me, accept that I have passed, grieve properly, and move on. Don't be swallowed up by your grief. Especially the fact that he begins to feel lighter, say floating away like a balloon, as the person accepts, this and moves on, no longer dwells in their grief, no longer is consumed by their grief. That's my reading of the poem. The two most common readings I've heard from students is that the speaker is someone who is elderly and close to death, and wants to die, has accepted that they're about to die, and has embraced that and ready for it to happen. But it hasn't quite happened yet, which is what those last two lines indicate. With you keep me away with your arm, but the keeping away is pulling me in. The other interpretation I often hear is that it's about an abusive relationship, and the speaker is perhaps a woman who has been abused and is kind of tormented with the way the listener, the male, gives his affection and then takes it away. But at the same time, they can't get out of this relationship. They want to be a part of it despite its destructiveness, which would be the last two lines there. So it's three different ways to read that first poem, Dissolver of Sugar, including my own. The second poem, The Question, is probably one of, if not, Rumi's most famous poem. And it deals, as many of these do, directly with religion. It's certainly the most complicated and complex. It may be his most complex poem, but it's certainly the most complex of the four we have in our textbook here. And Rumi does something often in his poetry that I think is really unique and interesting, where he takes expectations, things we typically see as opposites, and kind of flips those. And he does that here with fire and water. So in many religions, but especially Christianity, fire and water are seen in opposite ways. The line that fire is world-consuming and water is world-protecting, later in the poem, that encapsulates how people traditionally think of fire and water. But what ultimately I think he's saying in the poem by kind of flipping these two is that following God, whatever God you believe in, whether it's in his case probably either a Christian God or Allah, but whatever God you follow, because he's addressing a very cosmopolitan audience here, he's saying that is difficult, that it's easy to be tempted away from that, and you will go through trials. If you really believe in God till the end and make it to heaven, water representing heaven, then you will have gone through trials. That will not be an easy path. And so thinking of the way we traditionally think of fire and water, we want to be in the water. We want to end up in the water. That represents heaven. Fire represents hell. But at the same time, it's not easy to get to heaven, to get to the water. So on the surface, the water seems like fire and the fire seems like water. This is how he flips the two. And so the people who immediately try to go into the water actually end up in the fire, actually end up in hell, because they're trying to take the easy way there. They're not going through the trials that are inevitably a part of following God. And by taking the easy way, they end up and hell. They end up in fire. So the water, the surface, the first time we see the water, it turns out to actually be fire. But if we walk through the fire, if we walk across the hot coals that represent the difficulties and challenges of following God, then in actuality we will end up in heaven. Once we get through there, we'll eventually make it through the fire to the actual water. And so it's kind of a tricky poem where he flips these things, but he reveals what I think is, and I know we all have very probably different beliefs about God or lack thereof, depending on your beliefs. But I think it's a really kind of powerful message that, whatever your beliefs are, following God is not easy. And I think it kind of flips or critiques a cultural expectation, right? That people belong to a religion or believe in a God because it seems like an easy way out. Wherein Rumi here is saying it's actually very difficult, but it's worthwhile. So I'm not by any means trying to push any kind of religious beliefs on anyone. I just think it's a really, interesting message in this poem. And if you have some knowledge of Christianity or Islam, you can kind of see the religious symbolism here, and that might help you understand the poem. We have the same kind of use in a very similar but not nearly as complex poem called An Empty Garlic, where, I don't think I finished my sentence there, where in An Empty Garlic he also uses this kind of religious imagery and symbolism. So, in An Empty Garlic, he says, he opens with the line, "You miss the garden," which is, clearly in my mind an allusion to the Garden of Eden. And then he says, "Because you want a small fig from a random tree." And in Islam, my knowledge of Islam is somewhat more limited than my knowledge of Christianity, but in Islam, I believe a fig is supposed to be, from my understanding, a very important symbol, not dissimilar from the apple in Christianity. And then he goes on and says, "You don't meet the beautiful woman," so I'm thinking Eve there. "You're joking with an old crone." And as you read on here, I believe the crone represents the devil or sin, temptation. He's sad at how the crone detains the listener here. Stinking mouth with 100 talons, that imagery again makes me think of something evil. The fig is tasteless, it's as dry as rotten garlic. And so here, the title of the poem comes to my mind, An Empty Garlic. Garlic is again another kind of powerful religious symbol. It's often thought to have medicinal purposes, and in other cultures it's thought to ward off evil spirits. So if the crone, the nasty old woman here, as a foil to Eve, represents, sin, temptation, the devil, evil, etc., potentially the garlic could ward that off or fight that off, but it doesn't. If you peel away the layers of garlic, it's kind of like peeling away the layers of an onion. This person in this poem that the speaker is speaking to, peels away the layers of the garlic and finds nothing there. It's empty. So I see this again as kind of a cautionary tale against kind of falling for the false water in the other poem, the temptations, the sins of the world, the more earthly rather than ethereal things. And that's represented by the crone, as well as by the black wool lizard with the leather spine in the second stanza, who again, here it seems to clearly be a reference to, the serpent from the garden. And that line, "Death will open your eyes," really stands out as well. It seems to be, in Christianity as well as other religions, sin is associated with death. Death is the result of it. So it seems like he's saying, you think you're safe. You think that giving into the temptations of sins of the world will not hurt you, but in actuality it's killing you. And you may not realize that till you're staring death in the face. But, pull away from that in the last two lines in that final stanza, which seem to be significant since they're set apart. It's just two lines. So he's saying, pull away from all those temptations of the world that you don't think are hurting you, but in actuality they are, and come to the love of God, so that you're not destroyed by those things. So again, it seems like a very religious message, and again, I'm not trying to push any kind of religious beliefs on you. I'm just saying that that seems to be what the poem says. And at the same time, while he evokes specific religious symbols, he doesn't evoke them from just one religion. He evokes them from Christianity, from Islam, and then from any number of different belief systems that value garlic. And so by combining these, I think he's talking about sin and temptation in general rather than the ones that are associated with a specific religion, and talking about God in general, whatever God you as the reader believe in. So I think he's not trying to push people to a specific religion, but just trying to say, you focus on your spirituality, which is, again, I think even if you don't believe in any kind of higher power at all, it's still a very powerful message, and conveyed really interestingly through the poetry. The final poem, Only Breath, is probably the most straightforward, the least complex. And that poem seems to really take a more kind of cosmopolitan view of religion. Like I said, with the allusions to symbols from different religions in the past couple poems, I think he's always taking a more cosmopolitan view of religion in all of these poems. But the last poem really gets that with Only Breath. If you go through it by stanza or stanza, he dismantles any kind of pre-existing thing, religion or cultural system, the East or the West, the ground or the heavens, an origin story, a place. He's saying he's only breath. He's nothing else besides a breath-breathing human being. And so there are a number of ways to read this poem. I read it as saying, hey, it doesn't matter what your religion is. It doesn't matter where you're from. We're all people. We should all get along. Just because we believe in different religions doesn't mean we should be killing each other. Ratting us at the time of the Crusades, which makes him very, very brave in my mind and very cosmopolitan. And that's my interpretation, though. Students have interpreted it other ways. I can think of at least 3 other interpretations students have given over the years that I think are all supported by the text. Some do use this poem and the other ones we've looked at to actually kind of interpret them the opposite way as me, and see Rumi as more of an atheist, that in dismantling all these things here and saying he's just a breath-breathing human being, that he's denying the existence of God. Well, I don't agree with that interpretation. I do think it's supported by the text. Students also tend to see, in my past experience teaching these poems, tend to see it being like a universal God here, that everyone thinks they believe in different gods who are from different religions, but in actuality there's one God that they all believe in, and they just don't realize it's the same God. Again, I think he's saying, in my opinion, he's saying that those religious distinctions don't matter in the grand scheme of things. We should still love each other, which is different than saying it's all one God, but different interpretations. And the final one that I heard real recently from a student that's very interesting is that it's actually God speaking here, that God is the speaker, which, at least in Christianity, God not having a body, just being breath, would be very characteristic of God. And even though he says breath-breathing human being in Christianity, God does become human when he becomes Jesus Christ. So that reading is, again, still supported by the text, even though it's different from my own. And I think, like I said a few minutes ago, a very, very interesting, really clever reading. So those are some different ways to interpret Rumi's poetry. We spent a lot of time on it, which I think is really illustrative of the fact that lyric poetry is a genre we're studying for the first time in this lesson, can be very powerful. In just 10 lines or 15 lines, you can have all kinds of, very important, influential content to impact. So I hope you enjoyed reading those as much as I did. Okay. Again, I apologize. This is the slide I meant to come to with the specific instructions for how to paraphrase the poems. When I revised this PowerPoint, I thought I replaced the previous slide with this slide. Unfortunately, I just added it here. So Apologize for that, but here is the steps you can take to paraphrase the poem. And so you can either, you can answer a question on 1001 Nights for the discussion board, or you can answer a question on Rumi. You don't have to do both. And if you choose Rumi, you can answer a really specific question I have on the next slide, or you can just give, as number 7 says there, your interpretation of the poem. So those are the two options. And if you don't want to do the paraphrase and give your interpretation of the poem, you can answer one of these questions here that's more specific. And I say that in the first point there. So again, I'll have this updated on Canvas with these options if you want to answer a question about Rumi. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on Rumi. Now we're going to shift our focus, though, and look at the second text for this lesson, the 1001 Nights, which is one of the most well-known texts from the Middle East in Islam. We've already talked a lot about Christianity and Islam throughout the Middle Ages. So if you don't have that fresh in your mind, you might want to review the first part of this lesson. Here's some information that should be really helpful for you in learning about the 1001 Nights during this lecture. The title is symbolic. There's not literally just 1001 nights in the text. The idea is that theoretically the nights could go on forever. That's why it's 1001 nights instead of just 1000 nights. By adding one more to 1000, that implies an unending abundance. That theoretically Scheherazade could do this forever is what the title implies. It's an Arabic text derived from a Persian source, and that text was an inspiration for sharing stories and was subject to change with each new telling. So the first full text of the 1001 Nights emerged around the 13th century, I believe, but it had undergone many changes before that, and we don't know who the author is. These stories that are collected in it were around for a long time in the Middle East as well as in the West, and the frame narrative, which we'll get to in a second, the Scheherazade part, someone added that. Whoever the author or authors are collected these stories together and kind of bound them with a frame. And that happened in the 13th century, but the collection underwent changes before that. And so this brings us to the most important point on this slide. The 1001 Nights is a frame narrative, which makes it really unique, really interesting, and yet, in addition to lyric poetry, another genre we have not looked at yet. So it's an open-ended genre in which an outer story or frame provides a structure within which other shorter stories can be told. So it's really a collection of short stories, but you have the narrative of Scheherazade and the king driving all of those short stories. And this is important because it's not just a collection of short stories. There are larger themes that are echoed throughout each story, and the stories are chosen and placed together strategically to relate to what's going on in the frame that surrounds them. There are other examples of frame narratives. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales would be an example, but I cannot think of any text where the frame is as fully fleshed out and as significant to the stories throughout as it is in the 1001 Nights, or a frame narrative story where the stories within it have as much symbolic significance in relation to the frame as 1001 Nights. So 1001 Nights is really like the best example of a frame narrative, although there are other examples out there. And the way that it works as the best example of a frame narrative is we have a really significant story surrounding the other stories, and all of the stories really echo that story. And some of the themes that are prevalent in both the frame narratives and the story contained within are elucidated by Scheherazade's goals. And this also shows the complexity of her character. On the most basic level, it's self-preservation. She has to keep telling the stories each night in order to save herself. But she gets into this because she wants to save her countrywomen. So it's also self-sacrificial in addition to being self-preserving. Every night that she gets the king to let her tell another story the next night, she not only saves herself for another night, but also another woman from her country. And if she could do it forever, 1,001 nights on and on, she would save everyone in her country. Um, but her ultimate goal, and this isn't as obvious, her ultimate goal is by telling stories that all have to do with rule, with leadership. If you notice, that's one of the themes that's echoed in each story. Most of the protagonists are, kings or husbands, or farm owners or businessmen, someone who's in some kind of position of leadership. And so she hopes by telling the king stories about ruling, about leading, that she'll make him into a good king again. He initially begins the story as a good king, and then after seeing 3 separate examples of adultery, it becomes corrupted and believes that women are evil, even though the text isn't necessarily saying that they are. He believes that after he sees just 3 separate instances of adultery. So that kind of ruins him and sways him away from being a good king. And she's hoping that by telling him specific stories, kind of through subliminal messages, right? It's not obvious, it's subtle. She makes it seem that the stories are very entertaining, and they are, to keep him wanting to hear more. But if they also have this kind of subliminal moral message, maybe she can help him give up his evil ways and become a good king again. So those are her goals, and that's why you have this very powerful frame narrative, and its themes are echoed throughout all the stories. Relating back to what I said at the very start of this lesson about the relationship between Christianity and Islam during the Middle Ages, this poem later on, after the time period of this class, sorry, it's not a poem, this frame narrative, after the time period of this class, became very popular in Europe, but not necessarily for the right reasons. I shouldn't say right reasons, but not necessarily for what we'd see as more positive reasons or the literary value for which we read it today. And Europe, especially Britain, France, other places, colonized much of the East and the Middle East during the 18th and 19th centuries, and they became fascinated in kind of an obsessive way with Eastern and Middle Eastern culture. And as their empire conquered those parts of the world, these European countries wanted to learn more about the East, but in a stereotypical kind of condescending way. And so there's a lot of sexuality in the 1,001 Nights, and it may have been jarring to you as you read the 1,001 Nights. But as much sexuality as there is, we have a really good translation in our textbook by a very reliable Middle Eastern scholar with his PhD, Hussein Hadaway. And so there were hundreds of translations throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and many of those played up the sexuality even more so. And so what those translations tell us, they don't really tell us anything about the Middle East. They make it seem like people from the Middle East are obsessed with sex, but because they're being translated by Europeans, what they really do is reveal European fantasies about the Orient and reveal things to us not about Middle Eastern people, but about European people. And European people are actually the ones obsessed with sex, and especially Middle Eastern sex. So it's kind of a complicated point to untangle, but when you think about the sexuality that appears in this text, you have to think about how that was received by readers outside the East as this text became very popular, and how it fits in a tradition of imperialism that portrayed and saw the East in a very condescending way, often over-sexualizing it because of European fantasies rather than anything innate to the Middle East. And so hopefully that point makes sense and kind of helps you understand the sexuality in the text better, and also kind of shows that relationship between the East and the West, and how it was very complicated but interrelated throughout the emergence of Western civilization. Um, so the reading questions. As I pointed out in my reading questions email, this is a really fun text to read. It's not just a frame narrative with stories inside it. It's a tale that champions storytelling. Storytelling is the theme of this tale. And so within this story, Scheherazade is telling the king, other characters start telling stories, and you get deeper and deeper and deeper into the frame where there's, at times 3 or 4 layers. And before a character concludes his story and it comes back to Scheherazade, all these other characters have to tell their stories. And so as you read, you get deeper into it, and you kind of have to trace back, who is telling the story, how many layers are there. And so that really shows how deep and intricate the frame is. And that makes it really fun to read. You start reading and it's kind of hard to stop. So even though it was a little bit longer than the things we've read so far, hopefully it was interesting and fun to read, and you just were able to keep going because of that. But as intricate as the story gets, as we get deeper and deeper into stories within stories, 2 themes seem to be very prevalent throughout. One is the phrase good management is used over and over again. And as I mentioned on the last slide, we consistently see kings and husbands, fathers, merchants, businessmen, farmers, people who are in leadership positions, who are in authority over others, at least in the context of the time period in the tale. And so, by giving those examples, Scheherazade is able to kind of pose a question to the king: what makes good leadership? What is good management? And that's why we see that phrase over and over again. But it's really a question, she's trying to answer. And the other phrase we see repeated throughout multiple stories is be kind to those who hurt you. And that's really the answer to the question of what is good management. The king has been hurt. He's seen his wife cheat on him. He's seen his brother's wife cheat on him. He's seen the demon's captured wife cheat on him. So he feels very hurt. And his response to being hurt is to hurt others, to marry a different woman every night and kill her, rather than to respond with kindness, rather than to say forgive. Or rather than forgiving, his response to those things he sees is to become evil and to believe that all women are evil, even though they actually aren't. And so she's saying, in contrast, be kind to those who hurt you. And so it's a very, again, shows the overlap between Islam and Christianity here, because it's a very kind of turn the other cheek, love thy neighbor kind of message. And she believes the king would benefit from it. But again, it's a subliminal message. These are just characters within her story saying this and giving examples of good leadership. So it's kind of a subliminal message she uses to teach the king. And because we see these 2 phrases repeated in multiple stories, again, that reflects the frame narrative thing I was talking about, that all of the stories are chosen for a purpose and connect back to that frame story of Scheherazade and the king that surrounds the text. So a lot of my questions here relate to what we've already talked about. I'm not going to spend too much time on these last couple slides because we've already spent quite a bit of time on this lesson. And in talking about good management and the idea of being kind to those who hurt you, we really have talked about some of the main themes for the text. But I'll just kind of hit a few highlights here for you while I'm rounding out this lesson with the last 5 minutes or so. It's important here to think about what your experience of reading a frame narrative was like. Was it exciting to keep going on and getting deeper into the stories within stories, or what were other reactions? What do you think of Scheherazade? Other than Antigone and Dido, we haven't really seen any strong female characters, and even then they've been not necessarily the most complex characters. So Scheherazade is really one of the first very strong, complex characters we see. She's able to kind of hold power over the king, but not by, say, stealing his power or by becoming a martyr like Antigone. She doesn't have to die. She's able to get him interested in the stories. He's the one, who wants to hear more, who puts off her execution. And at the end, eventually, if you were to read the whole thing, falls in love with her, marries her, stays married to her, never marries again, and becomes a good king again. It works. But she doesn't have to do anything with force. She doesn't even really have to steal power. She's able to get him interested in the stories, and he wants to hear more stories. So in some ways, that makes her much more powerful than other female characters we've seen. She's also intelligent, well-educated, brave, obviously self-sacrificial. In the prologue, we see those three separate instances of infidelity that I mentioned. And again, I think if it were just one, that wouldn't be enough to make the king evil. We're supposed to believe that he's a good king. So it takes these three separate kind of growing in degrees of how extreme they are with each example to make the king become evil. And before we get to Scheherazade's storytelling, her father tells her two stories. And these are interesting because he basically says, if you don't do what I'll say, I'll beat you. I'll threaten you with violence, is the message that comes through from her father in those stories. And that's interesting because it doesn't work. She still goes on and marries the king anyway. And so in terms of the question of what is good management, that would be an example of bad management. It doesn't work. The text clearly points that out. She still goes on and marries the king. So why do we have her father tell stories before she tells stories? To give a different example, a kind of a foil here, an opposite. And he fails because he suggests using violence. He's not being kind. And so the king, Scheherazade's father, they turn to violence and to evil when faced with difficult circumstances, whereas Scheherazade gives all these stories of examples of either how turning to violence or evil fails or of how being kind works well. And when we actually get to the point of Scheherazade telling her stories, the three tales of the three old men are really helpful to understanding this. That's where the phrase "be kind to those who hurt you" really come through, especially the story of the three brothers who two of them keep losing their money, and the brother who's done a good job managing his money and invested it well gives them more money. They eventually turn into dogs. He's continually kind to his brothers and loans them the money despite the fact that they continually make the same mistakes. But eventually they learn. It turns out in a much more positive way than other examples where people are not kind to those who hurt them and they fail. Like we see in the stories her father tells her. So these are some passages that reflect what I just talked about. And finally, for the learning questions, if you'd like to focus on the 1001 Nights rather than Rumi in your discussion board post, I have some questions here about good management, about animals. There are a lot of animals depicted in this text, and over time, because of mythology, we've come to associate animals with different stereotypes. Donkeys or jackasses are clever, but perhaps immoral. The ox is a hard worker but not intelligent. The rooster is kind of like a hyper-masculine figure, etc. So these definitely show up in 1001 Nights. 1001 Nights may even be the reason why they become well known. So you can take a look at those. Important to think about Scheherazade's strategy here. And also, this is a text that can be very shocking. and very different from some of the things we've read already. So you can think about that too. And finally, I'll just add, and this is a question that's not on here, but is a question you can answer in your paper if you choose to write on the 1001 Nights, and I would say it's one of the most central questions of the text, does this text uphold or challenge the patriarchy? Obviously, it's a very patriarchal culture and time, like all the cultures and time periods we've studied already. But the text says some really awful things about women, while at the same time, Scheherazade is this incredibly positive example of femininity. So how do you reconcile those two things? Are the earlier comments, the comments about women being evil, are those just in the mouths of fools or corrupt people and not to be taken seriously, and the representation of Scheherazade is the thing that should characterize the text and we see it as a positive kind of challenge to patriarchy? Or are the two in conflict? That's something really interesting to think about with this text. But it's a very influential text, the most successful example of a frame narrative, and has been influential in a number of different ways, both positive and negative, for a really long time. But the text itself has a lot of literary value for its themes and lessons that we've already talked about. So I hope you enjoyed reading it.